The Southern War was graveyard for Continental Army when examining late 1780s cascading disasters that threatened to destroy American resistance below Virginia. Opens with chaos as Charleston fallen in May with over 5,000 Continental troops surrendering, catastrophic loss eliminating organized American military presence throughout South Carolina and Georgia. Gates destroyed at Camden in August when Horatio Gates's Continental forces were routed by Cornwallis, humiliating defeat demonstrating that British controlled Southern theatre militarily and psychologically. Loyalists rising throughout region as British successes convinced fence-sitters that supporting Crown was winning side. Popular sentiment shifting against rebellion when military situation seemed hopeless for American cause. Cornwallis' ascendant after series of victories made British commander appear unstoppable, his forces controlling major cities while American resistance fragmented into ineffective partisan bands. Into this nightmare walks 44-year-old general, whose physical condition suggested retirement rather than field command, Daniel Morgan being recalled despite chronic health problems because desperate situations required desperate measures. With bad back from decades of frontier hardship and from previous military service, physical ailments, making active campaigning painful but not preventing his return when Nathaniel Greene needed commanders who understood unconventional warfare. And genius for war that previous campaigns had demonstrated, Morgan's tactical instincts and his understanding of militia psychology, making him uniquely qualified for Southern command, where conventional European tactics had failed repeatedly. The stage is set for most perfect battle ever fought on American soil when Morgan's arrival in Southern theatre created conditions for tactical masterpiece that would demonstrate how outnumbered forces could defeat superior enemies. Through brilliant planning, exploiting terrain, troop psychology, and enemy overconfidence, making Cowpens' legendary example of tactical excellence, whose study continues in military academies despite its relative obscurity in popular American historical consciousness that celebrates more famous engagements, while overlooking perfectly executed battle that changed Southern campaign's trajectory and that contributed decisively to British strategic defeat, culminating at Yorktown. Daniel Morgan was reluctant revolutionary genius, whose background combined frontier violence with military brilliance, making him uniquely effective commander for Southern partisan warfare. Introduce Morgan's background beginning with frontier brawler, whose youth involved physical confrontations that prepared him psychologically for combat's brutality, early experiences developing toughness that formal military training could not provide. Wagon master during French and Indian War, when Morgan gained logistical expertise, and when he survived British military punishment that left permanent scars, experiences teaching him both how armies functioned and how British officers treated common soldiers. Hero of Saratoga, where his rifleman's marksmanship contributed to British defeat, tactical success, demonstrating Morgan's ability to employ irregular forces effectively against professional armies. A man who understands militia psychology better than any commander alive through personal experience as common soldier rather than as aristocratic officer, background allowing him to anticipate how civilian soldiers would behave under combat stress. Better than commanders whose European training emphasized professional soldiers' discipline, without understanding volunteer militias' different motivations and capabilities, Morgan's insights being based on intimate knowledge rather than on theoretical assumptions. He is exhausted from years of campaigning and from chronic health problems that made active service physically painful, fatigue being reasonable when examining his age and condition. Semi-retired from military service after physical ailments forced him to leave field command, withdrawal seeming permanent until Greene's desperate need. But Greene calls him back because Southern situation required commanders who understood irregular warfare and who could inspire militia confidence. Morgan's reputation and skills making him indispensable despite health problems. Him back into active service, despite Morgan's reluctance, and despite physical condition suggesting retirement was appropriate, recall demonstrating how desperate American situation had become when commanders were willing to risk Morgan's health for gaining his tactical genius that Southern campaign desperately needed for reversing British momentum that conventional approaches had failed to stop. Banastra Tarleton was British hammer with no brakes, whose aggressive tactics produced victories, but whose recklessness would prove fatal weakness at Cowpens. Tarleton, young at 26 years old, age giving him energy and confidence, but denying him experience that might have taught caution when facing skilled opponents. Fearless in combat where personal courage was unquestioned, Tarleton leading charges personally rather than directing from rear, as senior officers typically did. Charismatic leader whose personality inspired loyalty among his British Legion troops, personal magnetism making him effective commander of cavalry forces requiring bold leadership. And absolutely reckless in tactical decision-making, where Tarleton's aggressive instincts overcame prudent military judgment, previous successes against inferior American forces, convincing him that boldness always succeeded. Reckless meaning Tarleton accepted risks that careful commanders would have rejected, overconfidence from easy victories making him dismissive of American military capabilities. Cornwallis unleashes him to destroy Morgan before American general could threaten British control of South Carolina, mission being pursuit and destruction rather than mere harassment. Before he becomes threat by organizing effective resistance or by encouraging militia to challenge British authority, preventive destruction being Cornwallis's strategic objective. Threat to British campaign whose success depended on maintaining psychological dominance over American forces, Morgan's presence risking revival of continental resistance that Camden had seemingly crushed. Unleashes suggesting Tarleton was released without restraints on his aggressive tendencies, Cornwallis authorizing whatever methods Tarleton considered necessary for eliminating Morgan quickly before American commander could organize effective opposition, making Tarleton's pursuit an urgent mission where speed and decisiveness were prioritized over caution that might have recognized Morgan's tactical sophistication exceeded defeated American commanders whom Tarleton had previously crushed through aggressive charges that worked against demoralized or poorly led opponents. Morgan's ragtag fractured force combined diverse military units whose different capabilities and motivations created command challenges that conventional tactics could not address effectively. Militia whose civilian volunteers lacked professional training and whose combat reliability was questionable when examining their tendency to flee under sustained pressure, amateur soldiers being essential for numbers but being problematic for maintaining battle lines. Riflemen whose marksmanship exceeded regular infantry but whose slow-loading rifles made them vulnerable in close combat, specialized troops being valuable for skirmishing but requiring protection from bayonet charges, Continentals, meaning regular army veterans whose discipline and training made them reliable in sustained combat, professional soldiers being Morgan's tactical anchor despite their small numbers. Dragoons providing mounted troops whose mobility allowed rapid response, but whose limited numbers prevented them from dominating cavalry engagements against superior British horsemen. A patchwork army whose components had different strengths requiring tailored employment rather than uniform tactical doctrine, diversity creating coordination challenges. With wildly different skill levels ranging from continental veterans to militia who had never experienced serious combat, capability variations requiring Morgan to design tactics accounting for each unit's realistic performance under pressure, and limited discipline among militia whose civilian backgrounds made them resistant to military authority, obedience problems requiring leadership approaches different from commanding professional soldiers. Different from Continentals whose military service had instilled discipline that militia lacked, making Morgan's force organizationally challenging when conventional battle tactics assumed uniform training and discipline that his mixed force did not possess, requiring innovative tactical approach that would exploit each unit type's strengths while compensating for weaknesses that conventional employment would have exposed to British attacks designed for fighting professional armies rather than for countering hybrid forces, combining regulars with militia whose different psychology required understanding that European trained officers typically lacked, but that Morgan possessed through frontier experience and through previous irregular warfare campaigns. Tarleton's elite but overconfident legion represented some of Britain's finest light troops, whose combat record justified confidence, but whose overestimation of superiority would prove fatal. British regulars trained to European professional standards, whose discipline and tactical proficiency exceeded Continental Army's capabilities in conventional engagements, professional excellence, making them formidable opponents. Cavalry, whose mounted troops provided mobility and shock power that American forces struggled to match, British horsemen being better equipped and better trained than Continental dragoons. Light infantry, meaning specialized troops trained for rapid movement and for skirmishing, elite status, reflecting their selection and training for demanding roles. Some of best in world when comparing British light troops to other nations' military forces, professional quality justifying Tarleton's confidence in his legion's capabilities. They march hard, pursuing Morgan without adequate rest, aggressive pursuit reflecting Tarleton's determination to catch Americans before they could escape or reinforce. Without rest meaning Tarleton drove his troops beyond normal endurance limits, exhaustion being accepted cost for maintaining pursuit speed. Convinced they cannot lose, based on previous easy victories over American forces, psychological overconfidence making British troops dismiss possibility that Morgan might defeat them through superior tactics. Cannot lose assumption reflecting British experience where aggressive attacks had consistently routed American opposition. Success pattern making. Tarleton's forces contemptuous of enemy they expected to flee, as previous Continental units had done when facing British charges. Overconfident, because easy victories had not prepared them for facing commander who understood their tactical methods and who had designed battle plan exploiting their aggressive tendencies, making British psychological certainty into vulnerability that Morgan would exploit through creating tactical situation where British strengths became liabilities, when confidence prevented, recognizing trap until envelopment was complete. Morgan designs impossible trap through revolutionary tactical concept that incorporated militia's weakness into battle plan, rather than trying to overcome psychological limitations that previous commanders had futilely attempted to eliminate. Knowing his militia will break under pressure from experience observing civilian soldiers' behavior during sustained combat, Morgan accepted psychological reality rather than pretending discipline could be instilled quickly. He builds that into plan by designing tactical scheme where militia retreat was planned feature rather than being feared breakdown, incorporation of expected behavior, transforming weakness into strength. 3 lines consisting of riflemen as first line providing opening fire, militia as second line delivering volleys before withdrawing, Continentals as third line providing solid defensive anchor. Riflemen positioned forward to deliver accurate fire against British officers and to begin attrition, first line being expendable skirmishers whose withdrawal was anticipated. Militia forming second line with specific instructions to fire 2 volleys then retreat in organized manner. Limited expectations being communicated clearly, so troops understood their role. Continentals as final line, where veteran regulars would receive British assault after riflemen and militia had inflicted casualties and had fallen back. Third line providing stability that first 2 lines lacked. Each line designed to fall back on purpose rather than breaking accidentally. Planned withdrawals being coordinated tactical movements rather than panicked flights. On purpose, meaning retreats were intentional tactical maneuvers that Morgan had ordered explicitly. Psychological preparation, preventing militia from feeling ashamed about withdrawing since they were following orders. Fall back in sequence, creating tactical depth where each line inflicted damage before retiring. Layered defense, maximizing casualties inflicted while preserving American forces, through avoiding decisive engagement, until British were exhausted and disordered from attacking through multiple defensive lines whose planned withdrawals would draw British into killing zone, where Continental line and cavalry would deliver decisive counterattack that Morgan's impossible trap was designed to produce. The terrain that turns chaos into geometry was Cowpens' battlefield, whose physical characteristics Morgan exploited for channeling British attacks into predictable patterns. The Cowpens' battlefield being gently rising pasture whose open ground offered clear fields of fire, terrain simplicity making tactical movements visible and making coordination easier than in broken ground. With nowhere to hide, meaning troops could not seek cover from enemy fire, exposure making casualties inevitable, but also making battlefield transparent, where commanders could observe developments clearly. becomes part of Morgan's design when he recognized that terrain's openness would encourage British to attack directly rather than maneuvering, predictable enemy response being exploitable. Tarleton sees open ground and thinks easy victory because terrain appeared to favor British conventional tactics, emphasizing frontal assault, visual assessment, suggesting battle would follow familiar pattern, and thinks British advantages in discipline and training would be decisive on open ground, where American militia could not hide or maneuver away from charges, terrain seeming to guarantee British success. Morgan sees perfect killing zone, where terrain's openness would prevent British from avoiding American fire during approach, exposure working both ways when Americans were positioned defensively. Sees tactical opportunity, where terrain would channel British into frontal assault that Morgan's layered defense was designed to receive. Predictability, allowing precise planning. Perfect for Morgan's purposes because open ground meant British would attack predictably, while American defensive lines could maintain formation and could coordinate withdrawals without terrain obstacles, causing confusion. Battlefield simplicity, making complex tactical plan executable by troops with limited training. Killing zone created through combining terrain's exposure with Morgan's defensive arrangement. British confidence in terrain's suitability for their tactics, making them blind to how same terrain characteristics that seemed advantageous for offense were equally advantageous for prepared defense that could inflict maximum casualties on attackers crossing open ground under fire from multiple defensive lines. The rifleman's sting was opening phase of Cowpens battle when Morgan's first line delivered devastating volley targeting British officers. Morgan's first line fires opening volley whose accuracy exceeded British expectations, rifleman's marksmanship producing disproportionate casualties among British leadership. Picks off officers deliberately through selective targeting that Morgan had ordered, eliminating British commanders disrupting tactical coordination at battle's outset. And retreats by design following Morgan's explicit instructions to fall back after delivering initial fire, withdrawal being planned rather than being panicked flight. By design meaning rifleman's retreat was orderly tactical movement that Morgan had incorporated into battle plan, first line's withdrawal being expected outcome. Tarleton thinks they're routing when observing American withdrawal, British commander interpreting retreat as evidence that American forces were breaking under pressure. And accelerates pursuit, believing he was exploiting American collapse, Tarleton's aggressive response being exactly what Morgan had anticipated and desired. Accelerates, meaning British increased attack speed without pausing to assess whether American withdrawal was genuine rout or tactical maneuver. Eagerness, overcoming caution. Pursuit that drove British forces deeper into Morgan's trap. Acceleration meaning British troops were advancing rapidly, without maintaining formation discipline that defensive fighting would have required. Their routing being Tarleton's misinterpretation based on previous experience, where American withdrawals had been genuine collapses, pattern recognition, making him blind to possibility that Morgan was implementing sophisticated tactical plan rather than losing control of forces, making rifleman's sting effective both for casualties inflicted and for psychological effect of encouraging British overconfidence that would lead them to attack recklessly into subsequent defensive lines that were waiting to receive their disordered assault. The militia's fake retreat that breaks history was second phase of Morgan's plan, when civilian soldiers executed tactical withdrawal that convinced British they were witnessing American collapse. Morgan orders militia to fire 2 volleys whose combined effect would inflict significant casualties, specific number being within militia's capabilities, while maximizing their contribution. Then retreat after delivering prescribed fire, withdrawal being planned element that Morgan had communicated clearly to militia who understood they were following orders rather than fleeing. They execute it flawlessly through maintaining formation during withdrawal, and through avoiding panic that would have turned organized retreat into chaotic flight, militia's discipline exceeding what their civilian background suggested was possible. Flawlessly meaning militia performed exactly as Morgan had instructed, despite combat stress that typically caused civilian soldiers to break, successful execution, demonstrating that clear limited objectives were achievable even by amateur troops. Tarleton's men believe Americans are collapsing when observing militia withdrawal that appeared identical to genuine routes they had seen previously, visual similarity making tactical deception effective. Are collapsing based on British experience where American militia typically fled when British attacked aggressively, pattern making Tarleton's interpretation reasonable but incorrect. They charge headlong into trap without pausing to verify whether American withdrawal was genuine or feigned, British eagerness to exploit apparent victory overcoming tactical caution. Into trap that Morgan had designed specifically to exploit British aggressive tendencies, militia's fake retreat drawing British forces deeper into killing zone where Continental Line was waiting. Headlong suggesting reckless speed without proper reconnaissance, British confidence making them careless about advancing into unknown tactical situation. Breaks history through being perfectly executed tactical deception that conventional military wisdom suggested militia could not perform. Civilian soldiers' successful implementation of complex maneuver, demonstrating that appropriate tactical employment could make amateur troops effective when their limitations were incorporated into planning rather than being ignored or wished away as previous commanders had attempted. The Continental Line stands like wall was third phase when British assault reached Morgan's veteran regulars who did not retreat as first two lines had done. The British slam into third line expecting panic based on previous American withdrawals that had suggested complete collapse, momentum carrying them forward confidently. Expecting panic because first two American lines had withdrawn, pattern suggesting third line would also break when attacked. Instead, they meet veteran Continentals whose professional training and combat experience made them resistant to psychological pressures that broke militia discipline, allowing them to maintain formation under fire. Under John Howard, whose leadership of Continental infantry was skilled and whose troops trusted his tactical judgment, command competence being essential for maintaining line integrity during British assault. Steady, meaning Continentals, maintained position without wavering, despite British attacks' intensity. Psychological stability, contrasting sharply with militia's fragility. Disciplined through professional military training that had instilled automatic responses to commands. Institutional conditioning making Continentals reliable under extreme stress. Deadly in delivering coordinated volleys that inflicted heavy casualties on British forces whose approach across open ground made them vulnerable to massed fire, Continental marksmanship and discipline, combining to create defensive effectiveness. Like wall suggesting immovable obstacle that British could not break through despite attacking with confidence born from easy victories over militia, Continental resistance shattering British expectations and British momentum. Stands, meaning Continentals held position when British expected them to flee. Tactical surprise being psychological as much as physical. When British confidence encountered unexpected resistance from troops who fought with professional competence that British had not anticipated after easily routing first two American lines. Making Continental stand critical moment when British advance was halted and when tactical initiative began shifting toward Americans whose layered defense had inflicted cumulative damage on British forces that were now facing fresh troops, rather than broken militia. Howard's pivot and double envelopment was climactic phase when American forces surrounded British who had advanced into trap. Howard performs brilliant pivot when tactical confusion threatened Continental Line's integrity, quick thinking, transforming potential disaster into decisive advantage through repositioning troops for counterattack. And counterattack as American forces transitioned from defense to offense, tactical shift catching British by surprise when they expected to be pursuing defeated enemy. As American dragoons smash into Tarleton's flank simultaneously with Howard's pivot, cavalry attack coordinating perfectly with infantry movement to create converging assault. Smash into flank, meaning cavalry struck British from side where they were vulnerable and where they were not prepared to resist mounted assault. Positional advantage making dragoon charge devastating. Militia return and attack from behind after having withdrawn earlier, their reappearance creating third attack axis that completed encirclement. And attack from rear where British had no defensive preparations, militia's unexpected return from direction British considered secure, creating panic. Tarleton's army is surrounded before realizing what happened because tactical developments occurred faster than British could process, envelopment being achieved through speed and coordination. Before it realizes suggests British were confused about tactical situation, lack of situational awareness, preventing effective response to encirclement. What happened, meaning British could not comprehend how victory had transformed into disaster, psychological shock paralyzing decision-making. Surrounded from three directions with Continental Line in front, dragoons on flank, and militia in rear, British forces were trapped in killing zone that Morgan's plan had created through sequential movements that drew British into center, while American forces converged from multiple directions. Double envelopment being tactical masterpiece that military theorists would study for demonstrating perfect execution of complex maneuver against professional army. The British Army collapses in minutes was final phase when encircled British forces disintegrated under converging American assault. In one of quickest routes in entire war, measured by time from encirclement to complete tactical collapse, British resistance ending almost immediately once soldiers realized they were surrounded. 110 killed, representing British dead whose bodies remained on battlefield, casualties being relatively light compared to wounded and captured, because most British soldiers surrendered once resistance became obviously futile. 229 wounded, whose injuries ranged from minor to severe, casualty number indicating intensity of final assault when Americans were firing into trapped British formations. 600 captured, representing majority of Tarleton's force, prisoner count demonstrating how completely British Army had been destroyed as fighting organization when most soldiers surrendered rather than dying or escaping. The British Legion destroyed as effective military unit through casualties and captures, eliminating its combat power, organizational destruction being more significant than individual casualties. Destroyed, meaning British Legion ceased to exist as functional formation, survivors being too few and too demoralized for reconstitution. Tarleton flees field when battle's outcome became undeniable, commander abandoning his troops for saving himself from capture, flight demonstrating how complete British defeat had become. Flees with small escort of cavalry who escaped encirclement through speed, Tarleton's survival being accident rather than planned extraction. Field meaning Tarleton abandoned battlefield and abandoned captured troops, desertion contrasting sharply with his earlier confidence. Minutes, referring to remarkably brief duration of final collapse, British Army disintegrating almost instantly once encirclement was complete and once soldiers recognized that continued resistance meant death rather than victory, making Cowpens notable for speed of British defeat as much as for completeness of American victory that eliminated Tarleton's force through perfect execution of Morgan's tactical masterpiece. Cowpens shatters Cornwallis's campaign through eliminating British light forces whose mobility and striking power had been essential for maintaining aggressive operations. Cornwallis loses his best light infantry, whose training and combat effectiveness could not be quickly replaced, elite troops' destruction, creating permanent gap in British capabilities. His cavalry strength being eliminated when Tarleton's horsemen were killed or captured, mounted troops' loss, removing British mobility advantage that had allowed them to pursue and destroy American forces. And his momentum that previous victories had generated, Cowpens' defeat shocking British and encouraging Americans, whose morale had been crushed by Camden and Charleston. He pushes north in desperation, attempting to catch and destroy Greene's main army before American forces could consolidate, Cornwallis's advance being motivated by need to recover psychological advantage through achieving dramatic victory. In desperation because Cowpens had undermined his campaign's viability, making decisive battle necessary for preventing complete loss of initiative. Straight into trap that eventually becomes Yorktown when pursuit exhausted British forces, and when Cornwallis's movement into Virginia placed his army where naval superiority was essential for survival. That eventually meaning causal chain from Cowpens through North Carolina campaign to Virginia, where French fleet would trap Cornwallis. Becomes Yorktown through series of decisions that Cowpens influenced, British defeat at Cowpens being first link in chain leading to Cornwallis's surrender. Yorktown, where British army would be trapped and forced to surrender. Campaign's end being influenced by Cowpens, which had eliminated forces Cornwallis needed for maintaining aggressive operations and which had forced desperate pursuit that exhausted British troops while leading them into geographic position where Washington and Rochambeau could trap them with French naval support, making Cowpens strategically decisive for revolution through destroying British light forces and through initiating sequence of events culminating in Yorktown surrender that effectively ended war. The perfect battle that America forgot represents paradox that Cowpens' tactical masterpiece studied worldwide but remains relatively unknown in popular American historical consciousness. Closes with grand truth acknowledging that Cowpens demonstrates tactical excellence at highest level, battle being example of perfect planning and execution against professional army. Cowpens' tactical masterpiece studied in military academies worldwide, where battle's brilliant design and flawless execution make it teaching example for demonstrating how inferior forces can defeat superior enemies through termite, exploiting psychology and terrain. Studied globally by military professionals analyzing Morgan's innovative tactics and his psychological insights about militia employment, international recognition contrasting with domestic obscurity. Yet barely taught in American classrooms where Revolutionary War education emphasizes Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown, while overlooking Cowpens, whose tactical sophistication exceeds more famous engagements. Barely taught, meaning most Americans are unfamiliar with battle despite its significance, educational neglect making Cowpens' forgotten victory. It was day. Daniel Morgan rewrote rules of war through demonstrating that militia could be employed effectively if tactics acknowledged their psychological limitations rather than ignoring them, revolutionary insight being Morgan's distinctive contribution. Rewrote through invalidating conventional wisdom that militia were useless in pitched battles, Cowpens proving that appropriate tactical employment made amateur soldiers effective. And saved revolution with victory that destroyed British light forces and that shattered Cornwallis's campaign, tactical success, having strategic consequences that contributed to eventual American victory. Historians still call flawless when analyzing battle's execution, where every element functioned as Morgan planned, perfection being rare in military history where confusion typically disrupts plans, making Cowpens' exceptional example of tactical theory being implemented perfectly in combat against professional army, whose defeat demonstrated that brilliant planning could overcome material disadvantages when commander understood both his own force's capabilities and enemies' psychological vulnerabilities. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.